Justice Transformation in Action, a podcast for youth-serving stakeholders. We are the RFK National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice, and we are on a mission to transform the youth justice system by partnering with people like you, who are passionate about improving outcomes for youth, families, and communities you serve. You will hear from experts in the field and on the ground who have championed reform on the local, state, and national level. We are your hosts. I'm Jody Martin.
I'm John Toole.
And I'm Michelle Darling. In today's episode, One Youth, Dual Systems, we interview the Honorable Kristen Johnson, judge from Hancock County Probate and Juvenile Court in Findlay, Ohio, and Jessica Heldman, Fellmeth-Peterson Professor in Child Rights at University of San Diego School of Law, Children's Advocacy Institute. Their conversation will focus on the most vulnerable youth who are involved with child welfare and juvenile justice systems, including those who are at risk for sexual exploitation. We will learn steps to develop a framework for collaboration that achieves what no single system can on its own, and how to overcome barriers to case planning to produce positive outcomes for these youth and their families. Stay tuned to the end of the podcast to hear about part 2 of this episode, and check out our website, rfknrcjj.org, and Twitter at rfkyouthjustice for more resources on dual status youth and other topics.
We have 2 very special guests this afternoon to share their expertise, their perspectives, and their experience with you. We are pleased to welcome Jessica Heldman, Fellmeth-Peterson Professor in Child Rights at the University of San Diego School of Law, Children's Advocacy Institute, and the Honorable Kristen K. Johnson, Hancock County Probate and Juvenile Court Judge in Findlay, Ohio. Welcome. Great to have you with us. Jessica, I'm going to turn to you and ask you to tell us just a little bit more about what you do within that role.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much for having us here to talk to you today. We're really looking forward to the conversation. At the University of San Diego School of Law, I have the privilege of teaching law students about practice in the juvenile court. This includes in dependency court and delinquency court. I supervise their work representing children in those courtrooms. And I also get to supervise students who are working on policy work related to those areas of the juvenile court. I also work as an attorney at the Children's Advocacy Institute, which means I get to do the hands-on advocacy through the legislative branch, through the executive branch, and in class action litigation to advocate for the rights of children in a number of different areas.
Thank you, Jessica. We'll learn a lot more about what that has done to allow you to share your expertise and your experience today. Judge Johnson, please tell me a little bit more about your role as the judge in Hancock County.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate being here. My role includes juvenile and probate. So on the juvenile side, I handle delinquency cases where kids have been charged with crimes, abuse, neglect, dependency cases. Those are the cases where Children's Services gets involved and removes children. And I also deal with parentage, so custody matters where parents are not married.
Great. Judge, I've had the privilege of working with you in Hancock County. Can you tell the audience a little bit about the community in which you work, the characteristics, the size, where it is in the state of Ohio?
We are about an hour south of Toledo, so Northwest Ohio is our area. We are a small town, so Findlay is about mid 40,000, and the county itself is about 78,000 in population. It's a small town, rural, so a lot of farming communities. Our population is not very diverse. We're about 97% Caucasian. The rest is made up of Black, Hispanic. We do have a Japanese influx from some different companies that we have locally.
I'm going to share for the audience also, Judge, that Hancock County was competitively selected to receive grant funds that allowed you to provide the leadership that you provided around this dual status youth initiative. And it's similar to 75 or 80 of the counties in the state of Ohio, which quite honestly reflects a great percentage of the number of jurisdictions in which this dual status youth work has been practiced across the country as well. We're here today to talk about these multi-system youth. And I'm wondering what it is, Jessica, through your experience, that made these youth a priority area for you.
Well, if you can bear with me telling a little bit of a story. I'd like to go back to before I was a professor or an attorney or a consultant. I was a drama teacher, and I had the opportunity to work with youth in the foster care system. And it was such a joy to give children a playful and a positive outlet during a really challenging time of their life. I decided to go to law school specifically because I wanted to help improve the system in which these children, my students, found themselves. And while I was in law school, I had the opportunity to represent youth who were involved in the juvenile justice system. And I was shocked and quite shook up when I found some of my previous students there. I had taught them when they were 7 or 8. We played games, we read Shakespeare together, and then I saw them locked up at age 14 and 15. They weren't offenders to me, they were kids. And I came to understand that there were a significant number of youth in our juvenile justice systems that had had previous or current involvement with child welfare. And it was very clear to me that these children had suffered from traumatic circumstances, and we were seeing some of the consequences of that in their behavior as they transitioned to adolescence. So I wondered what could be done to better address that trauma at an early point so that we could prevent later involvement with the youth justice system and all that entails. And so I was privileged to be able to work with RFK on dual status work following my time in law school, and really was motivated by working across systems to improve the lives of those children.
And Judge Johnson, would you care to illuminate your thoughts on how it is that you came to focus on this population of youth?
I have a very similar story, actually, John. When I started, I was a prosecutor prosecuting adult felons, and I kind of concentrated on the child sexual abuse cases. And I was prosecuting a case. Obviously, you get very close to the victims in the case. Thought I handled that well. And then some things changed in the office, and I ended up over in juvenile court. And when I walked in, one of the first people I met was now that 7-year-old victim who is now 14, facing a delinquency charge. So Jessica sounds exactly similar. And, I thought I got a great outcome. I thought I fixed everything, right? Of course, the guy went to prison and he's not going to be around to hurt her anymore, but definitely did not address all the issues in the family or the issues that she was facing. So that led to a little bit longer story of just looking at those cases, seeing where the different entities weren't talking to each other. I actually was involved in starting our Child Advocacy Center back in 2005 and trying to get all of the entities to talk, get on the same page and talk with one another and get better outcomes for kids, stop having kids tell what happened to them over and over and over again. When this came along with the dual status youth, this is just an extension of that. This is those same kids that end up with really bad outcomes, especially when they're involved in both systems. So how do we fix this? How do we make the system better for kids?
Wow. Well, I appreciate you both sharing that. Now we're 3 peas in a pod because, my background working directly as a probation officer, probation supervisor, certainly was during a time when maybe the great awareness of these multi-system youth and the generational impact it can have on them was foremost in my mind. I'm not sure I brought an approach that supported those efforts. And I have routinely attested to what I believe is at least a correlational reason for the loss of a couple of kids that I work with for a failed approach that didn't recognize these historical experiences and the impact on the way they respond to adults or respond to discipline or respond to opportunities in highly charged behavioral circumstances. So, having lost a couple of those kids that I work directly with, I guess we all 3 do demonstrate the kind of passion that is really necessary to make a change on behalf of these kids. When I say these youth, these multi-system youth, forgive me for a second, I want to at least provide a little background as I then challenge you to tell me a little bit more about what the characteristics are from your perspectives about these youth. But historically, in our experience over these years with more than 35 state and local sites nationwide, a wide variance of target populations have been defined. What we're trying to do is get to a place where the audience really recognizes who we're talking about today. So to more effectively support those local determinations of target populations, and then design appropriate interventions, develop appropriate services and corresponding policies, some common terminology was established in our third edition, which was a building on the first two editions of Lessons Learned for a decade of the National Resource Center's Dual Status Youth Guidebook. Jessica's intimately familiar with that because she's a co-author. These definitions that we identified recognize the historical use of descriptive terms, recent statutory developments among those states, and the language used among those like you, Judge and Jessica, who have made service to this population a priority. And we elected to use dual status youth as the overarching term to describe youth who come into contact with both the child welfare and juvenile justice systems and occupy various statuses in terms of their relationship to those two systems. So with that background, Jessica, can you tell me a little bit more about when we say dual status youth or dually involved youth, who are we talking about?
Sure. So as you said, dual status youth is kind of a broader term. I will say that research has shown us that many youth may have only historical contact with one system, like they've had historical contact with child welfare as a younger child, their case is closed, and then in adolescence, they get in trouble and they're arrested. There are also youth who have that concurrent contact. Those are the youth who we refer to as dually involved. Research has shown us that most often dual status youth have initial contact with the child welfare system. That's the first system that they come in contact with. And then subsequently, they come in contact with youth justice. This is very much like the story I told about the kids I worked with as a teacher. They were in the foster care system, and eventually, especially in adolescence, when really there's a lot of natural developmental processes that come into play that make it, not unheard of that kids get into trouble. They're engaging in some behavior that, frankly, if they weren't in foster care, if it was my child engaging in some behavior as an adolescent that could get them in trouble, I might have a response that does not involve law enforcement. But oftentimes when a child is in the child welfare system, law enforcement becomes one of the default responses to a youth's behavior. So we found that some of the risk factors for being dual status actually are related to those experiences in foster care. These are kids who have experienced placement in congregate care. That increases the risk of dual involvement. Kids who have experienced multiple placement changes, that instability oftentimes shows up as a risk factor for dual status involvement. These kids also tend to have complex needs. They have high rates of substance abuse, mental health issues. They're often experiencing educational issues when they are arrested, truancy, behavior problems in school, difficulty with their academic performance. We've found that dual status youth are disproportionately Black. Studies show overrepresentation of Black youth in dual status youth populations can be more than double that in single system populations. And I really want to emphasize that because there's disproportionality in our child welfare system, there's disproportionality in our youth justice system, and for dual status youth, it is exacerbated, it is exponential, and that's something we really need to be concerned about. I'll just add that although females are generally underrepresented in delinquency populations, they are represented at higher levels in the dual status youth population. And again, this intersects with racial disproportionality. We see high rates of Black females in our dual status youth population. There was a study in Los Angeles where they found 80% of Black females first petitioned to the delinquency court had experienced child welfare involvement. 80%. So I'll leave it at that because I think those are all really sobering statistics.
Sobering, what a great word for that. They're striking. They're certainly informative for the audience today as well, Jessica. This notion that we're not just talking about child welfare and juvenile justice. You captured these kids experience the substance abuse, the mental health, the educational challenges. The families are experiencing many of those behavioral health issues. You captured that beautifully. That's really the complexity of who we're talking about here and the challenge of coordinating to be able to serve the interests of providing a trajectory other than deeper into the correctional or the child welfare system is what confronts us. Judge Johnson, you see these kids in your court every day, and certainly you're going to see a more targeted version of them now with the great work that you've done in the leadership of the Dual Status Initiative in Hancock County. Just share with me what you see in these youth, who they are when you see them.
The typical ones we saw are kids that are locked up as a result of a domestic violence charge. That's the number one reason I get a call to lock a kid up is a domestic violence charge. It's typically against a family member, a parent, a sibling, and it's usually obviously very heated. It's also very typical that the police have been out there multiple times and have tried to diffuse the situation, and this is the last time, so they're calling me to lock the kid up. And what I see the next day is the parents are frustrated and they don't want to do anything. They don't want them back in their house. They don't know what to do. They've been promised other things from other people. And I found very often that these kids, I didn't know them. These are not my kids that are in every other day for a different kind of charge. These are kids that I've never had an opportunity to work with. And the parents would just come in and throw their hands up and say, we're not taking them back.
Let me hear from you guys. How would you characterize the outcomes for these youth absent targeted intervention for them?
They are among the toughest outcomes, among the poorest outcomes. While kids are in the system as dual status youth, they're more likely to experience the deeper end of youth justice system involvement. They're less likely to receive diversion services. Sometimes that's because of the family circumstances and the family isn't in a position or assumed to not be in a position to engage in supportive services that would allow their child to be diverted. Kids are more likely to be detained. And when they're detained, they can spend longer periods of time in detention because, as the judge mentioned, maybe their parents won't or can't take them back in, or they've been in a foster care placement and they're not being welcomed back into their foster home. So they can lose their child welfare placement, and that creates greater instability. And unfortunately, dual status youth experience really the poorest outcomes among system involved youth, even after their system involvement, even when they reach early adulthood. So these youth, studies have shown that they have higher rates of recidivism as compared to youth who only had child welfare involvement, youth without child welfare involvement. These youth are more likely to age out of the child welfare system after they've had youth justice system contact. Aging out means that they don't have a permanent home or family connection. These kids are more likely to experience homelessness, unemployment, jail stays in early adulthood as compared to youth involved in only one system. And what really troubles me about this is that despite having more systems involved in their lives, their outcomes are consistently worse. So that tells us we need to do something differently.
Thanks, Jessica. Judge, you want to comment?
Everything she said, ditto. Very bad outcomes. I think that a child sitting, hearing that their parents are not willing to take them back in, I don't know how you ever undo that. And then just the engagement of the family is poor from that point forward. The trust from the juvenile is damaged from that point forward. So we have issues throughout the case. And what I've seen is they're very likely to remain in. They'll go from detention to a foster placement and another foster placement and another foster placement because they don't last, and they'll age out in the system.
It's amazing. You guys have brought up some great points. I hope the audience is digesting the fact that the trajectory for these youth is really towards poor outcomes in our status quo. And our status quo is often that we bump them from one system to another, or we duplicate the same resource, or the definition of insanity, we keep trying what we tried before without changing any of the approach, which is usually that we're not coordinating. They're hearing 3-4 different voices on what they're supposed to do, which is impossible for a family or a caregiver, a foster caregiver, to really manage that situation in a very challenging behavioral environment for that youth. And I will add, and I hope that you would support this, but if we quantify fiscally the cost of this approach, the deeper into correctional alternatives, the deeper the penetration into residential alternatives, and that's in the juvenile system. Jessica, you mentioned they don't just age out. Many times these youth are at higher risk for continuing this cycle of behavior into the adult criminal justice system as well. So the costs become a cost to our community and our society as well. And yet we have, editorializing here for a moment, folks, we have jurisdictions across the country who are still in the mode of no, you take them, no, you take them, without a true collective community response. That's not true of what your leadership has provided in Hancock County, Judge. You mentioned earlier, maybe let's bring it really directly to the audience. You deliberately chose a target population of those youth who are being charged with domestic violence. Why?
Well, they're the toughest kids. They are the toughest kids to place in a foster placement. They're the toughest kids to deal with the whole family, because it's a whole family issue. And we thought, and they have the worst outcomes, without question, the worst outcomes. So we thought if we wanted to make the biggest impact, let's start with the worst. And by worst, I mean toughest. I don't mean to be that they're the worst kids. That's, I would never want to say that about a child. So we started there. That's, and I think the entire team was completely on board from the beginning. You were there. It's kind of we kind of picked a different population than some other jurisdictions have, but definitely what we were seeing as our toughest cases.
You know, we're going to get to your team and the importance of the collaboration. We're starting to border on the edge of that part of our conversation today, but let's not keep the audience waiting any longer. Judge Johnson, you're already realizing some impact. Some of the kids that are part of your target population are not going to detention because you've arranged for an alternative respite in a foster care setting outside of the home. You've arranged a collaborative multidisciplinary team the next morning when the charge is filed, and that's realizing some averting of even the formal petition while still providing the service to ameliorate the risk and stabilize the situation. Am I correct in characterizing that that's what you're seeing in many of the cases already?
We've had 23 cases through our program. Some are still in, but out of the 15 that have finished, we've been successful in 7 of those cases to keep those kids not only from the juvenile justice system, but also from the child welfare system. So that's a 46% success rate, if that's what we're calling success. But even on top of that, we've kept the other ones from going into foster care. I think that the meeting the next day with the family, it's very much a we are in this together meeting to offer services to the family. I have to give a shout out to my team. My team is phenomenal. You've met them all, John. You know that what I think of them, but they are doing a phenomenal job. And when they talk with the parents, they completely are on the side of the parents and are in with them to understand that they've been living with this for a long time, and that maybe they've been promised things from other agencies or whatever, but this time it's different. We're going to work to get the kid home with them in a way that protects everybody, that's safe, and has services in there, and there are people for them to call. We do that the very next day. I did do a contract with the local foster agency, and instead of those kids going to detention, they go to a foster placement for that night. And it's an unofficial placement. It's not a child welfare placement. It's just for the evening. We can extend that out a couple of days if we need some time to get some additional services in there. But it's, when you look at the cost, you know, if people are concerned about dollar signs, which I am not, but this is even a winner on the dollar sign side of the ledger.
You're breaking the cycle of their instant involvement in the justice system or placement removal or placement instability, the research is certainly indicative that we want to undermine the future reoffending risks, and we certainly want to stabilize the placement. You're doing both and realizing that. Jessica, not unusual for us historically, but I'm going to ask you to join me in a figurative flight up to about 10 to 20,000 feet. And I'm going to ask you why it is that, from your experience, you would offer that it's so critical that we develop this cross-system practice for these youth.
One thing I'm thinking of after listening to the judge speaking is that it's just so important that we have a good understanding of what's happening to the youth and families in our communities, right? And that really takes bringing everybody to the table with their perspective and their experience. What Judge Johnson is talking about is, in her jurisdiction, is actually a kind of unique target population, as she noted, that these are not kids that necessarily have had these long-standing child welfare cases and are picking up an arrest. These are kids who, they're coming before her for the first time because of that difficulty with the domestic violence case. And then we're seeing some of the family supports that are necessary. So I would just say that, multidisciplinary cross-system work is important because people have different expertise, different perspectives, different resources, different information that can really help create the most comprehensive and thoughtful and well-informed approach to changing those outcomes for dual status youth. And as we talked about, their needs are complex, these kids. They're more multifaceted than any one system can successfully address. So by collaborating, we leverage all of those areas of expertise and a broader set of resources. But even more to the point, I think that the importance of collaboration by system partners really is illustrated by stepping into the shoes of a child or a family member that is having to deal with these systems. Put yourself in their shoes. Imagine all the various professionals involved in their lives, all the various decisions that are being made, the requirements that are being put upon them, the case plan details. If we want them to succeed, it's critical that we, as the system folks, do the work of coordinating and collaborating so that, as you said, we don't duplicate efforts, we don't issue conflicting orders, we don't create unrealistic expectations because we're unaware of the multitude of things that youth and families are dealing with. So I like to really center our work and our perspective on how the children and the families are experiencing our systems and build out practice from there.
It's not done on an individual basis based on personalities. It's important that we institutionalize this collaboration. It's the institutionalization of the practice, of the policy, of the procedure, and then have an expectation that that will be routinely implemented on behalf of each of these youth that we built this collaboration around. And then the other key point is it's not just around or on behalf of, it's with the youth and the family, despite the challenges of working with them under the distress that they're facing, despite the reticence, recalcitrance, the oppositional behavior that we might see. It's critical that they're part of that collaboration you're speaking to. I think you would agree with that, Jessica.
When we talk about the outcomes for these youth, it's really important that we emphasize that these outcomes are not determinative. So we need to address and approach every youth as someone who has the potential to realize the most positive outcomes. We don't want to come in with a frame of mind that has us think simply because of the research that we've seen that any individual child is destined to experience those outcomes. So to your point, John, it's so important that the individual youth, the individual families are part of the process, are driving the process, so that we can really make sure that we're tailoring everything we do to their individual needs and their individual assets.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm going to turn back to you, Judge, because you mentioned earlier your team. We're now talking about the collaboration. Yes, I have no qualms about saying your team is extraordinary. I have great pleasure every time I come and see you all operate. They may have had some built-in relationships that allowed us to have a pathway to success, but not all of it was in place without some of your leadership, both your personal and the professional respect that you've garnered. Yes, that's a compliment. I think I've seen it in practice, though, so I can speak to it firsthand. I would like you to comment on your view of what role you played as in your judicial leadership role to help bring this collaboration together to function so routinely around the process that you built.
Well, thank you, John. It's very kind of you to say. It's hard for me to take credit because my team's doing all the work. And honestly, it was just a matter of inviting everybody, talking about the issue. Everybody acknowledges that these kids are tough. Everybody acknowledges that we need to do better. And in fact, this is just the beginning for Hancock County as far as this population, because we want to spread it to all of them. You know, we want all the kids to benefit from what we've learned and how we're working. So it was just a matter of asking them to come to the meeting. And, you know, when the judge calls, they answer the phone and they come. So I did do that. But we included our probation department, our local mental health agency, family resource center, children's services, the school, the prosecutor's office, the public defender's office, our local police agencies. They've all played a role in all of this. So they've all been instrumental in not only coming up with the policies, working through the policies, talking about how we get around everybody's stuff that they have, the requirements that they have, what they have to do to get their job done. And we've worked around all of that. And our prosecutor and public defender were instrumental in getting all of the legal side of it, everybody working the right way. And the police now call me and say, Judge, I'd really like this child to go to respite instead of to detention. I mean, that's huge, huge. Now, they feel free to tell me if they don't feel that that's, this child isn't safe, so needs to go to detention today, but they will tell me either way. And I think that that's just phenomenal. That tells you that everybody's bought into the program and believes in it.
Yeah, and you've orchestrated that this collaboration is truly respectful, it's trusting, it's committed to the goals and the objectives that you've laid out. If you don't mind, I do need to make sure the audience understands, I did walk into a very respectful environment, respect for you and respect among your colleagues. But part of your judicial leadership, in my humble estimation, is that you were informed about the issue. You were clear about the goals and the objectives. You did invite everyone's perspective as you discussed whether or not this was a feasible, plausible approach. And then you've continued to invite feedback on the actual implementation so that everybody who's affected by the procedure still gets a say in what little tweaks or adjustments you can make to better serve the youth and families. And I think another piece of your judicial leadership is that you're very mindful of what it is that you're trying to achieve. And your collaboration doesn't lose sight of that. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. And Jessica, turning back to you, a sub-target population of this whole discussion is tragically those youth who are sexually exploited and or human trafficked. You've done a great deal of work in that arena. You have significant expertise. You're a partner with us in some of the TA initiatives that we have in other jurisdictions across the country. Could you comment about why CSEC youth, commercially sexually exploited children, youth, are so important to address through this kind of framework?
Absolutely. Commercial sexual exploitation of children, we know it's happening, but it is notoriously underreported. So we have to be looking for it. Why it's underreported, there's a number of reasons. Kids who are being trafficked are made to be afraid. Fear is instilled in them by the people exploiting them. These children distrust service providers and law enforcement who they believe will arrest them because they historically have, or keep them away from exploiters that they unfortunately believe are people who care about them. So that makes it really hard to intervene with kids. There's, of course, a stigma around the experiences that exploited children have had that make it very hard for kids to talk about. And frankly, kids don't even recognize themselves as victims. They see their exploiter maybe as a boyfriend. Maybe it's a member of their family or somebody that, says that they're family. and says that they're treating them as part of their family, someone who cares about them. That's very confusing, very difficult for kids to navigate. And so this is happening. It's happening in every single state. It's happening in all kinds of communities, rural communities, urban communities, northern states, southern states. It's happening everywhere. And so we have to be looking for it. And John, you know, the work that we've done around dual status youth for a couple of decades now, we still run into jurisdictions that are not identifying that they have youth in common, that a kid picks up a charge and our youth justice system doesn't necessarily know or have a way to find out easily and routinely that the child is engaged in child welfare. Those are two really, high functioning systems, and they haven't found a way to identify these kids. How about the kids who are victims of something that we know far less about as professionals? There's far less training about how to recognize them, and kids, the victims themselves, are not, coming to find help, or they're being hidden away by those who are victimizing them. So it's so important that we put our energy into understanding this problem and being able to identify these youth so that we can intervene and protect them and help them take steps that will stop this victimization.
There are certainly methods by which we can commit to that will allow us a better early identification of this population, Jessica, but built around the collaboration that would involve law enforcement, schools, and the other entities we've talked about so far. But at least for this moment, can you at least comment on whether or not we have appropriate screening instruments that help professionals understand whether or not these youth that they're confronting, that they're seeing entering these systems, are in fact at risk for or are being exploited or trafficked? Can you comment on that?
Sure. We're at a great point right now where we do actually have screening tools that have been developed and they've been through the process of being validated. There are a number of tools that can be used. John, when you and I collaborate and work together in jurisdictions that want to target the commercial sexual exploitation of children, that's one of the first things we do, is we talk about adopting a screening tool that is effective, but even more important, or at least as important as identifying that tool and adopting it, is implementing it. And implementing it requires a baseline understanding of this issue of commercial sexual exploitation of children. That comes from training that needs to be done by members of all different systems. And then the implementation is really about identifying where are the points of contact where somebody might come in contact with a child who's being exploited. And this is going to include your child welfare system. It's going to include your youth justice system. It's going to include law enforcement. It's going to include your school systems and education, foster parents. Everybody needs to understand the risks, and everybody has a role to play, whether it's just keeping an eye out for the signs or whether it's actually engaging in a routine process of screening using a tool. That it needs to be a community-wide discussion about everybody's role and responsibilities.
I'm going to capitalize on that. The end of your statement, the community discussion, the community awareness, it's all those entities, but it's our community as well, the community at large. It's the parents, it's the youth centers, it's everything that makes up our community having an awareness, because as you say, it's among us everywhere. We're not immune to it in the smallest of rural jurisdictions or the largest of urban jurisdictions. Judge Johnson, I'm going to just ask you real quick. You know that I've encouraged with you guys that what you are developing is a true community response in Hancock County. I think you've embraced that. I think you've built that. Are you finding any sexually exploited youth among your population in Hancock County?
We are. Our difficulty is identifying them because it does take some input from the child, and a lot of the times they are not admitting, even though, from the bench I can see a concern that I have. I usually call the Human Trafficking Coalition, bring them in, and they'll interview, and very rarely do they get a disclosure from the child. And I agree with everything Jessica said. A lot of times they don't realize, they don't think they're a victim. And when you talk to them about that, they'll say, I'm not. they don't have a sense of family. They don't have a sense of safety that they can even point to as a ground. I'm not saying that very well, but their basis of what a family is or what safety is not accurate in any way.
Very distorted, no question. And again, the way you guys have responded, I appreciate that. I just hope that the audience recognizes that this is likely a larger issue for concern in our community, in their community, than we may realize, and a collective effort that is often supported by the way we bring together the community and the agencies in the dual status work gives us an opportunity to really focus on this very challenged, very vulnerable population of youth.
Such an informative conversation, John, Jessica, and Judge Johnson. Join us next month for part 2 of this podcast, where the discussion continues on the core strategies to improve outcomes for dual status youth and those who are sexually exploited. And remember, we want to hear from you about what you think about the podcast series and bring you topics and guests that you request. Your feedback and ideas are welcome at rfknrcjj@rfkcommunity.org. To learn more about the RFK National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice, visit our website at rfknrcjj.org and follow us on Twitter at RFK Youth Justice.